Hello, and welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we travel back to the cold, candle-lit winter of 1953 to a grand old country house in Sussex, where Christmas has brought together a family and a secret that should have stayed buried. Miss Jane Marple has come to spend the holidays with an old friend at Fenwick Hall, expecting nothing more than carol singing, mince pies, and quiet fireside conversation. But behind the locked door of the attic, among broken ornaments and forgotten boxes of tinsel, lies a body no one can explain. The family insists it was a tragic accident. The local constable is inclined to agree, but Miss Marple, who has seen a great many accidents in her long life in St. Mary Mead, is not so certain. Before the last candle is lit on Christmas Eve, she means to find out exactly what happened in that attic. If you enjoy a good old-fashioned murder mystery, settle in, perhaps pour yourself something warm, and stay with me. This one's a slow burn, and worth every minute. Now, let's begin. Arrival. The train to Sussex had been cold, and Miss Marple had spent most of the journey with her gloved hands tucked into her muff, watching the frost-covered hedgerows slip past the window. It was the 23rd of December, and the whole countryside seemed to be holding its breath for Christmas. Adelaide Carrow was waiting for her at the small station, wrapped in a fur-collared coat that had clearly seen better decades, waving with the enthusiasm of a woman who did not get nearly enough visitors. "Jane! Oh, my dear, you look wonderful. Come, come. The car's just outside. Though I warn you, Hutchins drives it as though it were still pulled by horses." Miss Marple smiled and allowed herself to be steered toward an aging black motorcar, where an elderly chauffeur touched his cap without much enthusiasm. "It's so good of you to come all this way," Adelaide said, settling into the seat beside her. "Fenwick Hall does get rather gloomy this time of year, what with just the family rattling about in it. I thought a familiar face would do us all good. I was very happy to be asked," Miss Marple replied, though she could not help noticing a certain strain in her old friend's voice, a brightness that seemed almost deliberately maintained. Fenwick Hall, when they arrived, was every bit as handsome as Miss Marple remembered from Adelaide's letters, a sprawling Georgian house with ivy creeping up one wing and smoke curling from no fewer than 4 chimneys. Wreaths hung on the front door, and through the windows she could see the warm glow of a fire already lit in the drawing room. "The whole family's here this year," Adelaide explained as they walked up the gravel drive. "My nephew Charles and his wife Eleanor. You'll like her, I think, though she's a bit highly strung. Then there's Charles's sister, Margaret, who never married, poor thing, and has rather settled into being everyone's conscience. And my brother-in-law, old Reginald, who's 80 if he's a day and says whatever comes into his head." "How delightful," Miss Marple murmured, filing each name away with the quiet attention she gave to everything. Inside, the house smelled of pine and beeswax candles, and a young maid took her coat with a curtsy that seemed almost startled, as though she weren't quite used to having guests. The family was gathered in the drawing room, and Miss Marple took them in with the unhurried, faintly vague gaze that so many people mistook for harmless old lady curiosity. Charles Carrow was a tall man in his 40s, handsome in a tired sort of way, with the look of someone who smiled often but laughed rarely. His wife Eleanor sat very upright in her chair, her hands folded a little too neatly in her lap, and when she greeted Miss Marple, her eyes did not quite meet hers. Margaret Carrow was younger than Miss Marple had expected, perhaps 35, with sharp, intelligent features and the sort of restless energy that suggested she would rather have been doing something useful than making polite conversation. And in the corner, by the fire, sat old Reginald Carrow, wrapped in a tartan blanket despite the warmth of the room, watching the proceedings with the bright, beady eyes of a man who missed very little. "So this is the famous Miss Marple," he said, before anyone else could speak. "Adelaide's told us all about you. Solves murders. Does she tell you that? Right under everyone's noses." "Reginald," Adelaide said, with the weary patience of long practice, "Jane is here for Christmas, not for murders." "Pity," said Reginald, and turned back to the fire. Miss Marple laughed politely, though she had not missed the brief, tight glance that passed between Charles and Eleanor at his words. There and gone in an instant, like a draught through a closed door. Tea was brought in, along with a plate of seed cake that Miss Marple privately thought a touch too dry, and the conversation turned to the usual pleasantries of the season. The carol service at the village church, the difficulty of finding a good goose this year, whether it might snow before Christmas Day. And yet underneath it all, Miss Marple sensed something else, something she could not quite name. It was in the way Margaret kept glancing toward the ceiling, as though listening for footsteps that never came. It was in the careful, almost rehearsed cheerfulness with which Eleanor spoke of the decorations still to be brought down from storage. "We always do the attic on Christmas Eve," Adelaide explained, noticing Miss Marple's curious look. "Such a tradition in this family. Hutchins fetches the boxes down, and we all decorate the tree together. Reginald's father started it. Oh, must be 60 years ago now." "How charming," said Miss Marple, and meant it, though she found her gaze drifting, unbidden, toward the high ceiling above them, where somewhere, 2 floors up, behind a locked door, she would later learn, the attic sat full of old boxes and older memories. It was only later, as she was shown up to her room by the same nervous young maid, that Miss Marple noticed the narrow staircase at the end of the corridor, half hidden behind a tapestry curtain, leading up into darkness. "Where does that lead, my dear?" she asked pleasantly. The maid's hands tightened on the banister. "That's the attic stair, miss. Nobody goes up there, not till Christmas Eve. Mr. Charles keeps it locked." She paused, then added, in a lower voice, as though confiding something she oughtn't. "Gives me the shivers, that staircase does. Always has." Miss Marple said nothing, but as she settled into her room that evening, with the fire crackling cheerfully and the sound of carolers drifting faintly from the village below, she found her thoughts returning again and again to that locked door at the top of the stairs, and to the strange, careful way this family spoke of Christmas, as though it were a performance they had rehearsed a great many times, and were terribly afraid of getting wrong. She did not yet know what waited in the attic, but she had learned, over a long and quietly observant life, that houses which tried this hard to seem happy very often were not. In the next chapter, the attic door is finally opened, and Fenwick Hall's cheerful Christmas comes to an abrupt and terrible halt. The attic discovery. Miss Marple woke early, as was her habit, to the sound of someone moving about in the corridor outside her door. Soft footsteps, a muffled voice, and then, quite distinctly, the rattle of a key in a lock. She lay still for a moment, listening to the house settle around her, and then rose and dressed with her usual unhurried care, pinning up her white hair before the small mirror on the dressing table. By the time she made her way down to breakfast, the dining room was already half full, though something in the atmosphere felt different from the evening before, a kind of brittleness, as though the air itself had been drawn too tight. "Hutchins has gone up to start bringing down the boxes," Adelaide explained, pouring tea with a hand that was not quite steady. "Charles likes to get an early start on Christmas Eve. There's always so much to be done, the tree to dress, the holly to hang." "A fine tradition," Miss Marple said, accepting a cup. "Though I confess, attics rather frighten me at my age. So many stairs, and so very easy to trip over something in poor light." "Oh, it's perfectly safe," Eleanor said quickly. Too quickly, Miss Marple thought, glancing up at her. "Charles keeps it locked, precisely because of that. Loose floorboards, you understand, and old trunks everywhere. We wouldn't want anyone wandering up by accident." Margaret, buttering a piece of toast with rather more force than was strictly necessary, said nothing at all. It was perhaps 20 minutes later, while Miss Marple was admiring a rather handsome arrangement of holly on the sideboard, that the scream came. It was not a long scream, nor a particularly loud one, more a kind of strangled cry, abruptly cut short. But it was enough to bring the entire breakfast table to its feet in an instant. Charles was first out of the room, taking the stairs 2 at a time, with Eleanor close behind him, her napkin still clutched in one hand. Margaret followed more slowly, her face white. Old Reginald struggled up from his chair by the fire, muttering something Miss Marple did not quite catch, and Adelaide simply stood frozen, one hand pressed to her chest. "Adelaide," Miss Marple said quietly, "I think we had better go up as well." The narrow attic staircase, when they reached it, was crowded with people. The young maid, whose name Miss Marple now recalled was Susan, stood at the bottom step, weeping into her apron, while Hutchins the chauffeur leaned heavily against the wall, his face the color of old ash. "I only went up to fetch the boxes, ma'am," he was saying, to no one in particular, "just as I always do. I didn't expect, I never thought." Miss Marple climbed the stairs with Adelaide's hand gripping her arm, and at the top, in the doorway of the attic itself, she stopped. The attic was a long, low room beneath the eaves, lit by a single dusty skylight and crowded with the accumulated belongings of generations. Trunks, old furniture draped in sheets, and dozens of cardboard boxes marked, in faded ink, with words like ornaments and tinsel and tree lights. A string of old paper chains, half collapsed with age, hung from a nail near the door. And on the floor, beside an overturned box of glass baubles that had scattered and shattered across the boards, lay a man. He was perhaps 50, dressed in a worn brown overcoat that seemed entirely unsuited to a country house at Christmas, as though he had come from somewhere else entirely and never quite belonged. His eyes were open, staring up at the cobwebbed rafters, and there was a dark, terrible stain on the side of his head where it had struck, or been struck by, the edge of a heavy oak trunk. Charles was crouched beside the body, his face ashen, while Eleanor stood frozen by the skylight, both hands pressed over her mouth. "Dear God," Adelaide whispered. "Charles, who is that man?" "I don't know," Charles said, though Miss Marple, watching closely, did not entirely believe him. "I've never seen him before in my life." "He must have broken in," Margaret said from the doorway. Her voice was oddly flat, controlled. "Climbed up through the skylight, perhaps, looking for something to steal, and slipped on the boxes in the dark. It's an accident. A terrible accident." "The skylight's painted shut," Miss Marple observed mildly, though no one seemed to be listening to her. "I noticed it from the garden yesterday evening. Quite firmly shut, I should think, with the paint so old." If anyone heard her, they gave no sign of it. Charles was already on his feet, instructing Hutchins to telephone for the doctor and the local constable, his voice taking on the brisk, organizing tone of a man grateful to have something practical to do. Eleanor had begun to cry, softly, into her handkerchief, and Reginald stood in the doorway leaning on his stick, surveying the scene with an expression Miss Marple found impossible to read. Not quite shock, not quite grief, but something closer to a grim, weary recognition, as though he had always known this day would come. It was Margaret who noticed Miss Marple kneeling, with some difficulty, given her age and the stiffness of her joints, beside the body, peering at it with the same mild, unhurried attention she had given the holly arrangement at breakfast. "Miss Marple, please, you mustn't disturb anything. The constable will want to see everything exactly as it is." "Of course, my dear. Quite right," Miss Marple said, though she had already noted, with quiet interest, that the man's hands were unusually soft and clean for someone who had supposedly broken into a house through a stuck skylight, and that there was a faint, curious mark on his left wrist, as though a watch had recently been removed from it. She noted, too, that none of the scattered glass baubles appeared to be broken beneath him, but rather around him, in a pattern that struck her as oddly deliberate, as though the box had been overturned after he fell, not before. She said none of this aloud. It was far too early for that, and she had learned, over many years, that the most dangerous thing one could do in a house full of frightened people was to show one's hand too soon. "Such a sad thing," she murmured instead, allowing Margaret to help her to her feet. "And so very strange that he should choose this house, of all houses, to break into." Margaret's eyes flickered toward her for just a moment, sharp, assessing, before her expression smoothed over again into careful blankness. "Strange things happen, Miss Marple," she said quietly. "Especially at Christmas, I find." By the time the local doctor arrived, summoned hastily from the village, The family had gathered downstairs in the drawing room, where the fire still burned cheerfully, entirely indifferent to the tragedy unfolding 2 floors above it. Constable Hayes, a stolid, unimaginative young man, who had clearly never investigated anything more serious than a stolen bicycle, took down everyone's statements with great seriousness and even greater haste, seemingly eager to conclude that the unfortunate stranger had indeed broken in, slipped in the dim attic light, and struck his head. A tragic accident and nothing more. "Open and shut, I should think," he told Adelaide, snapping his notebook closed. "Wouldn't want to spoil your Christmas with a lot of fuss over nothing." Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the corner with her knitting, said nothing at all. But as the constable departed, and the family began, with visible relief, to speak once more of trees and holly and the proper way to glaze a Christmas ham, she found herself turning over, again and again, the curious image of those unbroken baubles scattered so neatly around a man who had supposedly fallen among them, and the small, soft, well-kept hands of a stranger who had, by all appearances, been somebody's guest before he had ever become Fenwick Hall's tragedy. It would take, she suspected, a great deal more than seed cake and carol singing to make this particular Christmas a merry one. In the next chapter, Miss Marple begins her quiet inquiries over tea, and the family's careful composure starts, ever so slightly, to crack. Questions over tea. The afternoon brought a thin, persistent snow, dusting the lawns of Fenwick Hall in white, and lending the house, Miss Marple thought, an air of deceptive innocence, as though nothing more sinister had ever happened within its walls than the occasional mislaid Christmas card. She found Adelaide in the small morning room, staring out at the snow with a teacup growing cold in her hands. "Jane," she said, without turning, "I keep thinking I ought to feel more shocked than I do. Isn't that a terrible thing to admit? A man has died in my house, and I find myself thinking about whether the goose will still arrive on time." "It is the mind's way of protecting itself," Miss Marple said gently, settling into the chair opposite. "One cannot dwell on horror every moment, or one should go quite mad. May I ask you something, my dear? Did you recognize that man at all?" Adelaide's hands tightened slightly around her cup. "No, I'd never seen him before in my life. And yet," Miss Marple said, with the mild, unthreatening curiosity she had perfected over so many years, Charles seemed very quick to say the same thing, almost as though he had been expecting someone to ask. "What are you suggesting?" "Nothing at all, my dear. Only that in my experience, when several people give precisely the same answer, in precisely the same words, it is sometimes because it happens to be true, and sometimes because it has been agreed upon in advance." Miss Marple smiled, taking up her knitting. "I find it terribly difficult to tell the difference at my age. My eyes aren't what they were." Adelaide said nothing for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice had dropped to something close to a whisper. "Jane, I don't know what's happening in this house anymore. There's been such an odd feeling here, ever since the autumn. Charles and Eleanor arguing behind closed doors. Margaret going off on these long walks and coming back looking as though she's seen a ghost. And Reginald, well, Reginald has always been difficult, but lately he's been positively strange, saying things at dinner that make no sense, and then refusing to explain them." "What sort of things?" "Oh, nothing specific, just odd remarks. Something about old debts coming due, about the past not staying buried, however hard one tries. I assumed it was simply his age catching up with him. He is 80 after all." Adelaide shook her head. "But now, with this poor man dead in my attic, I begin to wonder." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. "I think, my dear, that I should very much like to speak with everyone individually, if it would not seem too dreadfully nosy of me. Jane, you may speak with whomever you like. I should be grateful for it. I find I haven't the courage to ask the questions myself." It was Margaret she found first, in the library, ostensibly reading, but in fact staring at the same page for so long that Miss Marple suspected she had not turned it in some time. "Miss Marple." Margaret set the book aside with the air of someone glad of the interruption. though her eyes remained wary. "Come to question me, have you? Reginald did say you had a reputation."
"Only to keep an old woman company, my dear, while the snow falls." Miss Marple settled into the armchair opposite with a small, contented sigh, as though she had nothing more pressing on her mind than the weather. "Though I confess,
"I have been wondering about something. You said, in the attic, that the man must have broken in, and yet you said it so very quickly, almost before anyone had time to wonder otherwise. I find myself curious why you were so certain." Margaret's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "What else could it have been? We don't know him. He has no business being in this house." "Quite so. Unless, of course, someone in the house knew him, and simply hasn't said so yet." For a moment, something flickered across Margaret's face. Not quite fear, but close to it. "I don't know what you're implying, Miss Marple, but I assure you, I have never seen that man before in my life." "I never suggested you had, my dear," Miss Marple said mildly, though she noted, with quiet interest, the particular emphasis Margaret had placed on the word "I." "Tell me, has your family always kept the attic locked? It seems an unusual arrangement for a house with so many happy childhood memories of decorating the tree together." "It wasn't always locked," Margaret admitted, after a pause. "Only these past few years. Charles started it, after—" She stopped abruptly. After nothing. It isn't important." Margaret rose rather too quickly, smoothing her skirt with hands that were not entirely steady. "If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I find I have rather a headache." Miss Marple watched her go with the placid, unbothered expression of a woman who had learned, long ago, that a door closed too firmly was often more revealing than one left open. Her conversation with Eleanor, taken later over tea in the drawing room, proved similarly fruitful, though in a different way entirely. Where Margaret had been guarded and sharp, Eleanor was nervous, almost painfully so, her hands fluttering about the teapot, as though grateful for something to occupy them. "Such a dreadful thing," she said, for perhaps the third time. "I keep thinking, what if it had been one of the children who found him? Thank heaven they're still at school and not due home till tomorrow." "A small mercy indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "Tell me, my dear, has Charles seemed troubled at all of late? Before this dreadful business, I mean." Eleanor's hand stilled on the teapot for just a fraction of a second. "Troubled? No more than usual. Business worries, you understand. The estate isn't what it once was. Money troubles are such a burden," Miss Marple said sympathetically. "I find they bring out the very worst in families very often. Old grievances resurface, don't they, when there isn't enough to go round?" "I'm sure I wouldn't know anything about that," Eleanor said, a shade too quickly, and busied herself refilling a cup that did not need refilling. It was only as Miss Marple was leaving the drawing room, some minutes later, that she paused by the mantelpiece, where a row of family photographs stood in silver frames. Charles and Eleanor's wedding, a young Margaret in a school uniform, old Reginald considerably younger, and a great deal more upright. And there, tucked slightly behind the others, half hidden, was a smaller photograph. A young woman Miss Marple did not recognize. Standing in a garden, Miss Marple did not recognize either. Her face turned slightly away from the camera. "Adelaide," she said, as her friend passed through the room. "Who is this young woman? I don't believe I've met her." Adelaide glanced at the photograph, and something passed swiftly across her face. There and gone, like a shadow under a door. "Oh, that's no one, Jane. Just an old photograph. I really couldn't say who took it." She moved to straighten the frame, and in doing so, turned it so the young woman's face was hidden entirely behind the frame beside it. Miss Marple said nothing more on the subject, but that evening, as she sat by the fire in her room, with her knitting forgotten in her lap, she found her thoughts returning again and again to that small, half-hidden photograph, and to the curious, careful way an entire family could conspire, without ever quite saying so aloud, to keep a single face out of sight. She did not yet know who the young woman was, or what she had to do with the man who now lay cold in the village mortuary. But she suspected, with the quiet certainty of long experience, that by the time she found out, she would understand a great deal more about why Fenwick Hall's Christmas felt less like a celebration than a held breath. In the next chapter, Miss Marple goes searching for old letters and uncovers the first thread of a secret the family has spent decades trying to bury. Old letters, old lies. It was Reginald, of all people, who gave her the opening she needed. She found him the next morning in the small study off the library, a room thick with the smell of pipe tobacco and old paper, where he sat hunched over a chessboard set up for a game that had, by the look of the dust on it, not been played in some time. "Come to interrogate me as well, have you?" he said, without looking up. "Adelaide's told everyone you're playing detective. I rather thought it might be amusing to watch. I should hardly call it interrogation, Mr. Carrow. An old woman's curiosity, nothing more." Miss Marple lowered herself into the chair opposite, eyeing the chessboard with interest. "Do you play often?" "Used to. Haven't had anyone worth playing against in years." He glanced up at her then, and for the first time, Miss Marple saw something genuine flicker behind the gruffness. A kind of weary loneliness that old age and old houses seemed particularly suited to cultivating. "You want to know about the man in the attic? I confess I am curious. Everyone's curious. No one's honest." Reginald moved a pawn with unsteady fingers, though there was no one to play against. "I'll tell you something, Miss Marple, since you seem the sort who'd find it out anyway, one way or another. This family has been keeping a secret for the better part of 30 years. I don't know exactly what it is. They've never trusted me with the particulars, not since I started forgetting things, or pretending to, which amounts to the same thing in their eyes. But I know the shape of it, the way you know the shape of a stone under a carpet, even when you can't see it." "What shape is that, Mr. Carrow?" "A child," he said simply. "Or a woman. I never could be quite sure which. Someone who oughtn't to exist, by the family's reckoning, and who's been paid, quietly, for 30 years, to go on not existing." He looked up at her, his pale eyes suddenly very sharp. "And I'll tell you something else, Miss Marple. Dead men don't break into attics by accident. Not when they've been collecting an envelope of money every quarter for 3 decades, and the money's just stopped coming." Miss Marple sat very still. "How do you know about the money, Mr. Carrow?" "Because I used to manage the estate accounts, before Charles took it over. I found the entries years ago. A quarterly payment, always the same amount, always to the same initials, C.H. I never asked who it was. I'm an old man, Miss Marple, and old men learn that some questions are safer left unasked." He turned back to the chessboard, moving another piece with the air of a man closing a door. "But I'll say this much. When Charles took over the accounts 2 years ago, the payments stopped. And not long after, the attic started being locked. It was, Miss Marple thought as she left the study, precisely the sort of thread one might pull on for a very long time before it led anywhere useful, and precisely the sort she had learned never to ignore. The initials C.H. nagged at her through luncheon, through the afternoon's half-hearted attempt at decorating the tree downstairs, Margaret hanging baubles with a brittle, determined cheerfulness, Eleanor watching the door as though she expected the police to return at any moment, and it was not until the family had retired, ostensibly to dress for dinner, that Miss Marple found herself alone in the library, standing before a tall mahogany writing desk that had clearly belonged to Reginald's late brother, Adelaide's husband. She was not, by nature, a woman who rifled through other people's belongings. But murder, she had long ago decided, excused a great many small discourtesies, and she found the desk unlocked, its drawers full of the ordinary accumulated paper of a long-dead man's correspondence. Old bills, faded photographs, a few letters from solicitors regarding matters so dull she could barely force herself to read them. It was in the bottom drawer, beneath a false panel she discovered quite by accident, when her knitting needle, dropped and retrieved, caught on its edge, that she found the bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. They were old, the paper yellowed, the ink fading to brown, and signed, every one of them, with the same initials, C.H. "My dearest R," the first began, "I know you said it would be safer if I did not write, but I find I cannot help myself. The child grows so quickly, and I think of you both whenever I see her smile." Miss Marple read on, her expression growing graver with each line. The letters spanned several years, written in a careful, educated hand, and told, between the lines, in the way such letters always did, the story of a young woman named Clara Henley, who had once, many years ago, been deeply involved with a member of the Carow family. There had been a child, there had been promises, apparently broken, and there had been, in the final letter, dated some 28 years past, a kind of weary resignation that Miss Marple found more affecting than any anger could have been. "I understand now that you will never acknowledge us," the last letter read. "I do not blame you, not entirely. I know the world we live in, and what it would cost you. I ask only that you continue what you promised, for her sake if not for mine. She deserves at least that much, even if she may never know why." There was no signature on the very last page, only the initials again, and beneath them, in a different hand entirely, a man's hand, Miss Marple thought, hurried and angry, a single scrawled line. "She will get nothing more. It ends here." Miss Marple sat for a long while with the letters in her lap, the fire burning low beside her, piecing together what she now understood. A child, born outside marriage, kept secret and quietly supported for decades. And then, 2 years ago, abandoned entirely. The payments stopped, the door to the attic locked, as though locking a door could somehow lock away 30 years of obligation along with it. And now a man had died in that very attic, a man with soft hands and a missing watch, who had broken in, or been let in, just before Christmas, just when the family was most desperate to maintain its careful, cheerful performance of respectability. She thought of the small photograph on the mantelpiece, the young woman's face turned away from the camera, hidden so deliberately behind another frame. Clara Henley, she wondered, or perhaps the daughter, now grown into whatever woman 30 years of secrecy and disappointment might have made of her. But the dead man in the attic had been no woman. He had been perhaps 50 years old, too old, surely, to be the child of letters written only 28 years ago. Unless, Miss Marple thought slowly, turning the final letter over in her hands, he was not the child at all, but someone else entirely, someone who had known the secret and had come to collect on it himself. She was still turning this thought over, with the particular patient persistence she brought to all such puzzles, when the library door opened without warning, and Charles Carow stood in the doorway, his face white as he took in the sight of her. An old woman in an armchair, a bundle of faded letters open in her lap, and his father's private drawer standing visibly ajar beside her. "Miss Marple," he said, very quietly, "I think you had better explain what you are doing with my father's correspondence." "I think, Mr. Carow," Miss Marple replied, setting the letters down with perfect composure, "that it is rather you who owes the explanations. Who was Clara Henley, and what happened to the child you stopped paying for 2 years ago when you took over your father's accounts?" Charles did not answer immediately. He simply stood in the doorway, his hand still on the frame, and Miss Marple watched something in his face crumble. Not guilt exactly, but something close to it. The particular exhaustion of a man who has been carrying a secret so long he has nearly forgotten what it feels like to set it down. "You don't understand," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand what that family has cost us, what they very nearly cost this house." It was, Miss Marple thought, watching him carefully, very nearly a confession, and not at all the one she had expected. In the next chapter, Miss Marple follows a promising lead and makes the kind of mistake that even the sharpest mind is not immune to at Christmas. A wrong turn. Charles would say no more that evening, retreating instead into a stiff, formal politeness that Miss Marple recognized as the particular armor of a man who has said more than he meant to and is determined not to say a word further. Dinner that night was a strained affair, conducted largely in silence, broken only by Reginald's occasional, oblivious remarks about the goose, and Adelaide's increasingly desperate attempts to steer the conversation toward anything resembling Christmas cheer. It was afterward, while the family sat stiffly in the drawing room, pretending to enjoy a game of cards, that Miss Marple found herself drawn back to that small photograph on the mantelpiece, and to a thought that had been forming, slowly and with what she would later recognize as far too much confidence, ever since her conversation with Charles. If Clara Henley's daughter had grown up resentful of a family that had abandoned her, and if the payments had stopped only 2 years ago, it seemed entirely possible, even likely, Miss Marple thought, that the dead man in the attic had not been a stranger at all, but someone sent on the daughter's behalf, or even connected to her by marriage. A husband, perhaps. Someone who had finally lost patience with the family's silence and come to demand what he believed was owed. And there was, she recalled, a man in the village. She had heard Adelaide mention him only that morning, in passing, while discussing the arrangements for the church service. A Mr. Frank Doyle, who had moved to the area some years ago and had, according to local gossip, married rather beneath him, as Adelaide had delicately put it, to a woman no one in the village seemed to know a great deal about. It was, Miss Marple thought, entirely too neat a thread not to pull. The following morning, against Adelaide's mild protests about the cold, she had Hutchins drive her into the village, where she spent a pleasant hour at the local tea shop drawing out the proprietress, a Mrs. Hattersley, on the subject of Frank Doyle and his wife. "Oh, the Doyles," Mrs. Hattersley said, refilling Miss Marple's cup with the particular relish of a woman who lived for exactly this kind of conversation. Kept very much to themselves, they did, when they first came. Mrs. Doyle especially. Never one for the church socials, never joined the sewing circle, though heaven knows we asked her enough times. Some said she had connections to one of the big houses round here, though no one was ever quite sure which. "Is that so?" Miss Marple said, her interest sharpening considerably. "And Mr. Doyle himself, what manner of man is he?" "Quiet sort. Travels a good deal for business, or so he says. Hardly ever see him about, truth be told, though his wife's been seen walking up toward Fenwick Hall once or twice this past month, which I always thought was odd, seeing as the Carrows never had her to tea. Not once, not in all the years she's lived here." It was, Miss Marple thought, as she made her way back to the car, precisely the kind of corroboration that made an old woman feel rather pleased with her own deductions, and precisely the kind of feeling, she would later reflect with some chagrin, that ought always to be treated with the greatest suspicion. She spent the remainder of the day quietly cultivating her theory, turning it over with the satisfied thoroughness of a woman assembling a particularly pleasing piece of needlework, and it was not until that evening, over a final cup of tea with Adelaide before bed, that she allowed herself to voice it. "I believe," she said carefully, "that the man in the attic may have been connected to a Mr. Frank Doyle in the village, or perhaps even Doyle himself, travelling under some pretense, come to confront the family on his wife's behalf." Adelaide frowned. "Frank Doyle? Jane, I don't think that's possible." "Frank Doyle was at the church social on the 22nd, the very evening before you arrived. Half the village saw him there, helping set up the trestle tables. And besides, I happen to know he's a stout, red-faced sort of man. Nothing at all like poor Mr." She stopped. "Like the man who died." Miss Marple felt for a moment the peculiar, deflating sensation of a carefully constructed theory collapsing all at once beneath her, like a house of cards too eagerly built. "I see," she said, rather more quietly than she had intended. "I confess I had thought I was rather onto something." "You mustn't feel badly about it," Adelaide said, with unexpected gentleness, patting her hand. "Even you can't be right every time, Jane. You're only human, whatever the village gossips say about you." It was, Miss Marple reflected later, alone in her room with the fire burning low, and her pride considerably more bruised than she cared to admit, a useful reminder, and an uncomfortable one. She had allowed herself to be too pleased with a single piece of corroborating gossip, too eager to fit the facts to a theory that flattered her own cleverness, rather than allowing the facts to lead her, slowly and patiently, to wherever they actually wished to go. It was the kind of mistake she had warned a great many younger, more impatient minds against over the years, and she found it rather humbling to have made it herself, at her age, with a man's death weighing on the outcome. She thought again of the soft, clean hands of the dead man, hands that had never done a day's manual labor, certainly never the rough business of breaking into attics through stuck skylights. She thought of the mark on his wrist, where a watch had recently been removed, and of the curious, deliberate scattering of unbroken glass baubles around his body. And she thought, too, of Charles's strange, unfinished confession in the library. "You don't understand what that family has cost us." Words that suggested not a stranger demanding money, but something closer, more painful, more personal than a husband seeking justice on his wife's behalf. If not Frank Doyle, then who? The dead man had known this house well enough to find his way into a locked attic. He had come dressed, not as a laborer or a desperate husband seeking confrontation, but as someone who might once have belonged in finer company than his worn brown overcoat now suggested. Miss Marple closed her eyes that night with a single, uncomfortable question turning over and over in her mind. Not who is Clara Henley's daughter, but who, exactly, did Charles mean when he spoke of that family, with such bitter, weary resentment, as though the dead man and the Carrows had once, long ago, been connected by something far closer than money alone.
She did not yet have the answer, but she suspected, with the particular instinct that came only from having been wrong before, that she was finally asking the right question. In the next chapter, an old housekeeper's memory unravels the truth at last, and Miss Marple discovers exactly who the man in the attic really was.
The thread unravels. It was Susan, the young maid, who gave her the answer, though not, Miss Marple suspected, entirely by accident. She found the girl the next morning in the small scullery off the kitchen, polishing silver with the fierce, joyless concentration of someone trying very hard not to think about something else entirely. "You've been with the family a long time, my dear," Miss Marple asked, settling herself on a kitchen stool with the air of a woman simply glad of a warm room and friendly company. "Since I was 15, miss. My mother worked here before me, housekeeper, till she took ill 3 years back. I grew up practically in this kitchen." "How fortunate to know a house so well. I should think your mother must have known a great many of the family's secrets over the years." Susan's hands stilled on the silver for just a moment. "She never spoke of such things to me, miss. Said it wasn't her place, nor mine." "Of course not. Very proper of her." Miss Marple paused, choosing her next words with great care. "I wonder, though, is your mother still living nearby? I find myself rather wishing I could speak with someone who remembers this house as it was 30 years ago. So much changes in 30 years, doesn't it? And yet houses like this one seem to remember everything in their own quiet way." It took, in the end, very little further persuasion. Susan's mother, a Mrs. Gibbs, lived in a small cottage at the edge of the village and was only too glad, once Miss Marple had settled herself by the fire, with a cup of strong tea and an expression of patient, sympathetic interest, to talk about the years she had spent as housekeeper at Fenwick Hall. 30 years I gave that family," Mrs. Gibbs said, her hands twisting in her lap. "Saw old Mr. Carrow's sons grow up. Saw young Charles brought into the world myself, near enough. And I saw other things too, miss. Things I never spoke of, not even to my Susan, because what good would it do, dragging it all up again? I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that it may do a great deal of good now, Mrs. Gibbs. A man has died in that attic. I believe you may hold the key to understanding why." Mrs. Gibbs was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped to something close to a whisper. "There was a young man, miss, used to work as a groundskeeper here. Oh, must be 30 years back now. Daniel, his name was. Daniel Henley. Good-looking boy, clever too clever for his station, old Mr. Carrow used to say, though not unkindly. He and the young Carrow girl, Patricia, the old master's daughter, Reginald's niece, they took up together, quiet-like, the way young people do when they know full well their families would never approve." Miss Marple's needles stilled in her lap. "And there was a child?" "There was. A little girl, Clara, born quiet, away from the village so as not to cause talk. Patricia never married after. Heartbroken, I always thought, though she never said so to me. She died young, not 10 years later, of a fever that took half the village that winter. And the child, Clara, well, the family paid for her keep, quietly, all those years. Sent her to a good school, eventually, but they never once acknowledged her, not properly, not as family. And Daniel Henley, the father? Gone before the child was even born, miss. Sent away, paid to go, I always believed, though no one ever said so outright. Broke his heart, I shouldn't wonder, same as it broke hers. Mrs. Gibbs shook her head slowly. He came back, once, years later. I remember it clear as anything, because it was near Christmas, same as now. Came asking to see the child. Old Mr. Carrow sent him off, with hardly a civil word. Don't know as he ever came back again, not till— She stopped abruptly, her eyes widening. Not till when, Mrs. Gibbs? Susan mentioned it to me, miss, just the other day, though I scarcely thought anything of it at the time. A man came to the kitchen door, 2 days before you arrived, asking after the family. Susan didn't know him, sent him round to the front, but he never knocked, far as anyone saw. Older now, of course, weathered-looking. But Susan said he had a way of speaking, a softness to him, that put her in mind of someone better bred than his coat suggested. Miss Marple sat very still, the pieces settling into place, with the quiet, satisfying click of a puzzle long worked over, finally yielding its shape. Not Clara's husband, then, nor any stranger sent on her behalf, but Daniel Henley himself, the father, returned after 30 years to see the daughter the family had paid to keep hidden, and had finally, 2 years ago, stopped paying for it all. Mrs. Gibbs, she said carefully, do you know what became of Clara, the daughter? Married well enough, I believe, some years back. Lives in the village still, under her husband's name. Quiet sort of woman, keeps to herself. Mrs. Gibbs looked up, and something like dawning horror crossed her weathered face. You don't think— Daniel wouldn't have come back to make trouble, miss. Not after all this time. He was never that sort of man. I think, Miss Marple said slowly, rising from her chair, that Mr. Henley came back for a very different reason than trouble, Mrs. Gibbs. I think he came back because the money had stopped, and he wished to know why, and to see, perhaps, for the first time, what had become of the daughter he was never permitted to know. It was, she thought, walking back toward Fenwick Hall through the thin, persistent snow, a far sadder story than she had first imagined. Not a stranger's greed, but an old man's grief, returning at Christmas to a house that had spent 30 years trying to forget he existed. And yet a man did not break into a locked attic merely to grieve. Someone in that house had let him in, or had followed him up those narrow stairs and ensured he never came back down. She thought again of Charles's bitter words, "You don't understand what that family has cost us," and of Eleanor's nervous, fluttering hands, and of Margaret's sharp, guarded eyes. And she thought, with a growing and uncomfortable certainty, that whoever had gone up to that attic with Daniel Henley 2 nights before Christmas had not gone there to talk. By the time she reached the front door of Fenwick Hall, snow settling on her shoulders, Miss Marple had very nearly worked out who it must have been, and found herself wishing, not for the first time in her long career, that she might be wrong. In the final chapter, Miss Marple gathers the family together on Christmas Eve, and reveals, at last, exactly what happened in the attic. Christmas confession. She asked Adelaide to gather the family in the drawing room that evening, on the pretense of finally trimming the tree they had so half-heartedly begun 2 days before. Outside, the snow had thickened into something that might, by morning, become a proper white Christmas. Inside, the fire burned high, and the boxes of ornaments, brought down at last from the attic, now empty of anything but tinsel and glass, sat waiting on the table. "Miss Marple has something she wishes to say," Adelaide announced, with the strained brightness of a woman determined to get through the evening however she could. Charles stood by the mantelpiece, very still. Eleanor sat with her hands folded too tightly in her lap. Margaret hovered near the door, as though she might yet decide to leave the room entirely. Old Reginald, in his chair by the fire, watched with the sharp, unsurprised attention of a man who had been waiting for this moment for some time. "I think," Miss Marple began gently, settling her knitting into her lap, "that we have all spent the last 2 days pretending this was an accident, when every one of us knows, in our hearts, that it was not. The man who died in your attic was Daniel Henley. I believe some of you already knew that." A small, terrible silence fell over the room. "He came back," Miss Marple continued, "after 30 years, because the quarterly payments to his daughter Clara had stopped 2 years ago, when Charles took over the family accounts. He wished to know why. I think, more than that, he wished, after a lifetime of being kept away, simply to see, for once, the family his daughter had grown up belonging to, without ever truly belonging. This is absurd," Charles said, though his voice lacked conviction. "You can't possibly know any of this." "I know a great deal more than I wish I did, Mr. Carrow." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but there was steel beneath it now. "I know that the payments stopped because you decided 2 years ago that the family could no longer afford the burden of a secret you yourself had inherited rather than created. I know that Mr. Henley came to the kitchen door 2 days before I arrived and was turned away, and I believe that he did not simply give up and leave, that he came back again, that same night, and found his way up to the attic, perhaps hoping to find some proof of what had been promised him all those years ago." She turned, slowly,
toward Eleanor, whose face had gone the color of old paper. "I do not think, Mrs. Carrow, that you intended for any of this to happen." Eleanor's composure broke all at once, like ice giving way beneath too much weight.
"He wouldn't listen," she said, her voice cracking. "I went up to send him away. I didn't want Charles to know he'd come back, didn't want any of this dragged up again, not with the children due home for Christmas. I told him there was nothing more for him here, that he had to leave. And he said he didn't want money anymore. He said he only wanted to be acknowledged, just once, before he died. He said he would tell Clara everything, the whole truth, that very Christmas, whether we liked it or not. And you were afraid," Miss Marple said quietly, "of what that truth might cost your children, their inheritance, their place in this family." "I never meant to push him," Eleanor whispered. "I only meant to stop him reaching the stairs. I grabbed his arm, and he pulled away, and he stumbled into the trunk, and there was so much blood, and She broke off, pressing both hands over her mouth, shaking. "I found her there," Charles said, very low, stepping forward at last. "An hour later, I'd heard noises and gone up to investigate. I found her standing over him, and He shut his eyes briefly. "God forgive me, I helped her arrange it to look as though he'd fallen. I scattered the baubles around him. I told the constable he must have broken in. I have spent 2 days lying to protect my wife, Miss Marple, and I find I am no longer entirely certain I was right to do it." The room was utterly silent now, save for the crackle of the fire and the soft, broken sound of Eleanor's weeping. "It was an accident," Margaret said suddenly, into the silence, her voice unsteady. "Whatever else it was, it began as an accident. Surely that must count for something." "It very often does, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "The law makes distinctions, as it should, between those who set out to do harm and those who, frightened and desperate, do harm they never intended. I am not a judge, nor a jury. I am only an old woman who could not, in good conscience, let a man's death be buried under tinsel and a convenient lie, whatever sympathy I might feel for the woman who caused it." She rose, slowly, and crossed to where Eleanor sat weeping, and to everyone's surprise, she did not speak harshly, but laid a gentle hand upon her shoulder. "You will need to tell the constable the truth, my dear. Not because I demand it, but because Clara Henley deserves to know what became of her father, and why. And because secrets such as this one have a way of poisoning everything they touch, for far longer than 30 years, if they are allowed to go on being buried." She paused. "I think, too, that you have carried this alone long enough. Whatever happens now, it will be easier carried honestly than hidden." It was Reginald, surprisingly, who broke the silence that followed, rising unsteadily from his chair, leaning hard on his stick, and crossing to stand before Eleanor with an expression Miss Marple had not yet seen on his face, something that might, in a kinder light, have been called, "I should have told someone, years ago, what I suspected," he said gruffly. "Old men keep too many secrets, thinking it kindness. It is rarely kindness. It is only cowardice, dressed up nicely." He laid a hand briefly on Eleanor's bowed head. "Telephone the constable, Charles. Let it be done properly this time." The constable came that night, through the thickening snow, and what followed was neither so dramatic nor so swift as Miss Marple's own quiet unravelling of the truth had been, only the slow, sad business of statements taken, of a family's careful Christmas finally and irrevocably broken open. Eleanor went with the constable in the end, white-faced but composed, while Charles sat with his head in his hands before the dying fire, and Margaret wept, at last, the tears she had been holding back for 2 days. Miss Marple did not stay to watch it all unfold. She returned to her room, where her knitting sat half-finished upon the chair, and she thought, as she so often did at the end of such matters, not of the cleverness of having solved it, but of the sadness underlying it, of a man who had only wanted, after 30 years, to be acknowledged by a family too frightened of its own reputation to grant him even that small kindness, of a woman so afraid of losing what she had that she had taken, in a single desperate moment, what could never be returned. Christmas morning came clear and white over Fenwick Hall, the snow lying thick and untouched upon the lawns, beautiful in the particular, indifferent way that snow always was, regardless of what sorrow lay beneath a household's roof. Adelaide found Miss Marple at the window, watching the light change over the frozen garden. "I am so very sorry, Jane, that your Christmas should be spoiled by all of this." "Not spoiled, my dear," Miss Marple said, with a small, sad smile. "Only made a little more honest than it was. I find, at my age, that I have come to prefer honesty to comfort, however much the comfort might be wished for." She turned from the window, taking up her knitting once more. "Clara Henley will know the truth, at last, about her father. That is no small thing, on a day such as this, even if the manner of learning it brings little Christmas cheer." Downstairs, faintly, she could hear the village church bells beginning to ring, calling the parish to its Christmas service, as they had every year for centuries, indifferent to the small private tragedies unfolding beneath any one of the roofs they rang out over. It was not, Miss Marple reflected, picking up her needles once more, the merriest Christmas she had ever spent, but it was, perhaps, in its own quiet and difficult way, the truest one, and there were, she had long since decided, very much worse things in this world than that.